A 42-year-old diver exploring the ruins of a sunken coastal church off the coast of Savannah, Georgia, surfaced with something no one could explain: an enormous iron crucifix wrapped tightly in chains, as if someone had tried desperately to bind it or keep something in. He said nothing, not to the crew, not to the historians financing the dive. He slipped it onto his boat under the cover of dusk, telling himself it was just old metal. Valuable, yes, but harmless. But when the trembling in his hands began, and wouldn't stop, he feared it might not be. And then the image leaked. Not even 2 days later, a group of academics came forward, connecting the crucifix to the secret disappearance of at least 5 priests during the 1960s, cases buried in sealed state archives. When authorities reviewed the divers' footage, their expressions changed. "This," one officer whispered, "shouldn't have come back up. Would you have dared to touch it?" Subscribe for more stories like this one. Mark Devereaux had never considered himself a lucky man, just a careful one. At 42, he had built his life on precision, caution, and a kind of quiet reverence for the unknown. Originally from Baton Rouge, Louisiana, he moved to the coast of Georgia after a particularly rough divorce and found solace where most wouldn't: underwater. Diving became his escape, his ritual, his livelihood. People paid good money for recovered artifacts, especially those tied to folklore or faded history. Mark didn't care much for stories. He cared about condition, weight, and value. Until this dive. The church had been whispered about for decades. Locals referred to it as the Drowned Chapel, a 19th century structure swallowed by the sea during a hurricane in the late 1960s. The official story claimed the entire coastline had eroded overnight, and the church, along with everything inside it, had been lost. But rumors persisted that it had been used by the military during the Cold War, that strange vehicles were seen coming and going in the middle of the night, and that people, clergy mostly, had vanished just before the flood. Mark had heard the rumors too, but they meant little to him. What drew him there was the funding. A small history group from Atlanta had pooled money together, hoping to find pieces of stained glass or altar fragments to use in a museum exhibit. It was a modest contract, nothing like the high-value wrecks Mark usually pursued, but it paid up front and left him full control of what he found. That last part mattered, because it gave him the legal gray area to keep anything unlisted. The morning of the dive was uneventful. The sun beat down hot and thick, casting a golden sheen across the water. Mark's small boat rocked gently above the site, tethered to a buoy he'd dropped the day before. The ruins were 30 feet down. Not deep, but enough to keep casual divers away. He suited up, performed a quick gear check, and descended, his flashlight beam slicing through the murk. The first 10 minutes yielded little: broken pews, eroded masonry, some decorative brass fixtures barely worth salvaging. But then, as he swam past what must have been the chancel, he saw it. Not immediately. At first it was just a glint, faint, metallic, out of place among the coral and sand. He cleared away some debris, pushed aside a plank, and froze. It was a crucifix, large, nearly 4 feet long, iron, and wrapped, no wound, with rusted knotted chains. Every limb of Christ was bound, each link sunken deep into the metal, as if it had been forged that way. It looked more like a restraint than a religious symbol. It gave off no glow, no divine aura, only cold, stifling pressure. Mark found it hard to breathe. Still, he reached for it. His fingers hesitated, not from fear, but from something else. Instinct, maybe. The same way you'd hesitate before grabbing a live wire, even if you knew the power was off. But this was just metal, right? He unclipped a hook from his belt, tied it to the bottom of the crucifix, and slowly began to pull it upward. It was heavier than expected. Too heavy. It didn't seem right for a church artifact. This wasn't decorative. It felt punitive. When he finally hauled it onto the deck of his boat, water and sediment poured from its crevices like blood from an open wound. The chains clinked with a sound sharper than rusted iron should have made. He didn't speak, didn't call the team, just stared at it. And then, without realizing it, he wrapped it in a tarp and hid it beneath the engine compartment. Back on shore, he said little. Told the team he'd found some metal fragments and part of a candelabra. Nothing worth logging. The scholars were polite but clearly disappointed. They packed up early, promised to wire the rest of the payment, and left. Only Mark remained, boat idling at the dock, eyes still on the water. That night he dreamt of voices. Not distinct words, just murmurs echoing through salt water, and hands, pale, thin hands, reaching out from a submerged altar, all of them bound at the wrists by the same blackened chain. When he woke, his hands were trembling. At first, he blamed the dive. Nitrogen imbalance, maybe. Or nerves. But the shaking didn't stop. Not when he ate. Not when he tried to sleep again. Not when he poured himself a shot of whiskey and stared out at the ocean, hoping for clarity. It only got worse when he unwrapped the crucifix. He'd brought it into his shed, intending to clean it and maybe get a better sense of its age. As he peeled back the tarp, he felt a strange chill. Though the night air was humid and still, the chains hadn't dried. They were slick, almost oily, like they'd been pulled from the water just seconds ago. When he touched one, a jolt ran up his arm. Not painful exactly, but startling, like the feeling of static before a storm. And then, like a fool, he took a photo. Just one, from a distance. No flash. It was enough to catch the shape, the bindings, the twisted expression carved into the face of Christ. Mark wasn't religious, not really, but something about that image unsettled him. Still, he uploaded it to a private antiques forum, looking for appraisers or potential buyers who might recognize the style. No names, no context, just found object, unknown age, possibly European. He didn't expect anyone to notice. Not that fast. Within hours, the messages began. The first came from a user with no profile picture and no location. "Where did you find this?" It read. "Do not post anything else." Another user claimed to be a history professor and demanded a clearer image. A third simply posted coordinates, and they weren't for the coastal church ruins. They pointed to an old seminary in northern Alabama. By the next morning, one of the moderators messaged him directly. "We need to talk. That image matches a crucifix associated with multiple unsolved disappearances from the 60s. Please remove the post." Mark didn't know what to believe. He Googled the seminary. It had been closed in 1971. No public records, no known scandals. But the deeper he searched, the more strange details emerged. Anonymous articles, erased case numbers, whispered accusations. One thread claimed the church ruins he'd dived at had been a cover site for a covert military operation targeting subversive religious figures. No proof, just fragments, hearsay. But the coincidences were piling up. That same day, he got a call. It wasn't from anyone he knew. The voice on the other end didn't introduce himself. "Mr. Devereux," it said, calm but forceful. "We'd like to ask you a few questions about an item you may have recovered from the ruins near Tybee Island. It's important that we speak in person." He hung up. Within the hour, he noticed a car parked across from his trailer. Black sedan, tinted windows, no plates. He didn't sleep that night either. The following morning, he walked into the local sheriff's office and showed them the photo. The deputy's eyes widened. He called in the sheriff, who took one look and asked, "Where the hell did you get this?" Mark didn't answer. Not at first. But when the sheriff called in a man from the state archives, who arrived within 3 hours, he knew this had gone too far to keep quiet. The archivist didn't look like a bureaucrat. He had the stance of someone used to being obeyed. He examined the photo without touching it and muttered a few words Mark didn't catch. Then he turned to the sheriff and said, "This matches Object 6B. That file was closed in 72. The sheriff nodded slowly. "But that wasn't recovered. It was presumed lost." "No," the archivist said. "It was presumed buried." Mark's hands were trembling again. They asked to see the object. Mark hesitated, then nodded. By the time they reached the shed, the chains were dry. The crucifix was heavier than before, as if it had absorbed something. The archivist didn't speak as he inspected it, but the look on his face changed. "This shouldn't be here," he finally said. "Not anymore." Mark stared at him. "What is it?" The man didn't answer, but the next thing he said chilled Mark to the bone. "Do you know what was done with this? Would you have kept it, or should Mark have left it buried? Tell us what you think in the comments. Your theories might uncover what even the officials can't explain. Don't forget to hit like if this story has you hooked, and subscribe to never miss the next dive into the unknown. Let us know where in the world you're watching from. We're reading every comment. Would you trust your hands after touching this thing? Mark didn't answer right away. He stood there in his shed, the crucifix between them like a loaded weapon on a table. The chains no longer glistened. They looked black now, charred even, like they had been scorched by heat rather than soaked by salt water. The archivist's eyes hadn't left the object. This is classified Cold War relic material. It wasn't meant to surface again. Mark bristled. Classified by who? By people who knew what they were doing, the man replied, his voice low. And people who knew what it was used for. Mark shifted his weight, his boots scraping on the shed floor. He felt something, a pressure building in his ears, like the pressure underwater when you go too deep, too fast. He blinked. His hands were trembling again. No longer a slight shake. This was different, rhythmic, like his body was remembering something it hadn't lived. "Tell me what it is," he demanded. The archivist took a breath, then looked to the sheriff, closed the door. The three men stood inside the cramped space as the crucifix loomed in silence. The archivist finally spoke. In 1966, a church was converted into a secure detainment center for religious dissidents, priests suspected of anti-state activities. Officially, the place was abandoned, but unofficially, it was repurposed for what we now call advanced interrogation. This crucifix was central to that. Mark stared. As a symbol, the archivist's eyes darkened. As a tool, silence. It wasn't decorative. The chains were part of the process. The detainees were bound to it, forced to confess, but not just to politics. It was psychological deconstruction, breaking them, pitting belief against survival. The idea was simple. Destroy faith to destroy will. Mark's voice cracked. But why the church? It was convenient, isolated, already sanctified, ironically, and the program ran for less than a year. But 5 clergy disappeared. One of them, Father Alan McCready, sent a coded message to the Vatican before he vanished. It spoke of a blasphemous altar, a reversed Christ, and whispers in the walls. And the crucifix, Mark asked, was presumed to have been lost in the flood that ended the operation. Some believe it was thrown into the ocean to erase evidence. Others think the last remaining priest chained himself to it, and the sea took them both. Mark swallowed. But it's here now. The sheriff broke the silence. And what does that mean? The archivist didn't answer. Instead, he pulled out a small black folder from his coat, flipped it open, and removed a photograph. It was black and white, grainy, but the image was unmistakable. The same crucifix in a bare concrete room. The chains coiled around it in exactly the same pattern. A dark stain marked the floor beneath it. Another photo followed. A man, emaciated, hollow-eyed, strapped to the crucifix, his mouth wide open in a scream that no photograph could mute. Mark stepped back. "This isn't just an object," the archivist said. "It's a relic of trauma and pain." The Vatican still refuses to comment on McCready's disappearance, and state records were scrubbed clean in '72. Whatever happened, it was meant to stay buried, but it hadn't. The archivist gave one final look to the crucifix before snapping the folder shut. "You should never have touched it." He and the sheriff left not long after, both visibly rattled. Mark was alone again, but not really. The crucifix remained, watching him. He wrapped it back in the tarp, locked the shed, and drove straight to a diner an hour inland, hoping the distance would give his mind some air. But the tremor in his hands hadn't left. He spilled his coffee twice before giving up and driving to the local library, where he asked the old clerk for anything on the drowned chapel. The man looked over his glasses. "That place? Been closed since I was a kid. Some say the land was cursed." "Cursed how?" Mark asked. "They built it too close to the water line. That's what they said. But the way it vanished." He paused. It wasn't a storm. The ground gave out, like it was hollow underneath, like something was waiting. Mark sat for hours in the archive room. Most of the newspaper records from the '60s were missing, ripped out or redacted, but one microfilm reel caught his eye. A blurred article from 1967, just before the supposed storm. The headline read, "Chapel shuttered amid investigation. Vatican denies involvement." The article mentioned a Father McCready by name, referred to unusual rituals and questions of jurisdiction between church and military authority. Then, at the very bottom, a final chilling sentence. The last service held at St. Winifred's was not listed in any official record. No one can say what was preached or who attended. That night, Mark returned home. The crucifix was still there, still quiet, but the house didn't feel right. The shadows were longer than they should have been. The air was cold, unnatural. He couldn't sleep, not with the dreams. The same hands reaching, the same voice muttering Latin phrases he didn't understand, but could still repeat. He woke screaming. clutching his chest, the muscles in his forearms twitching as though he'd been pulling something up from the deep. When he opened the shed the next morning, the chains were no longer wrapped neatly. They had shifted, coiled now like a snake resting beneath prey. The iron was warm to the touch, too warm. Something was changing. By now, the story had started to spread. The online forum post had been taken down, but not before someone saved the image. It appeared on a fringe website 2 days later, accompanied by speculation, screenshots, and even a few amateur analyses. One thread linked it directly to Project Sabbath, an alleged Cold War program combining psychological warfare and religious inversion. Another claimed the object was older than the church itself, dating back to the Inquisition, maybe even before. And then came the emails, anonymous, cryptic. You should return it to where it was found. Not everything meant to stay buried can be. You are not the first to touch it, but you can be the last. He considered it, taking the boat back out, dropping the crucifix into the ocean's black maw, letting it sink back to silence. But something stopped him. Not greed, not fear, curiosity, and guilt. He started having seizures, minor at first, just blank spots, then full moments of paralysis. He would come to with his hands clasped in prayer, though he hadn't prayed in years. One time he found himself holding the crucifix in the shed, kneeling in front of it, whispering apologies, to whom he didn't know. That's when he contacted a man named Dr. Emil Kastner, an obscure historian based in Baltimore, who had once written about theological artifacts used as instruments of coercion. Kastner responded within minutes. Yes, the email read, if what you found is authentic, you're in danger. I'll come. He arrived 2 days later, gray suit, balding, eyes like polished glass, the kind of man who had seen too much and never slept well again. Mark showed him the crucifix. Kastner's expression didn't change until he touched the chain. He flinched. God help us, he whispered. It's real. Mark exhaled. What is it? Kastner stared at the object as if expecting it to move. These aren't just bindings. They're conduits, ritualized implements used in inverse liturgy, intended to break faith by reversing its symbols. Why would someone make this? Mark asked. Because belief is powerful, Kastner said, and power attracts corruption. If you can desecrate the sacred, you can bend the will of the believer. This crucifix wasn't meant to inspire devotion. It was meant to strip it away. Mark nodded slowly. And now. Kastner ran a hand down the chain, recoiling slightly again. Now it's hungry, not for food, for memory, for pain. That's why your hands shake. It's drawing from you, feeding on guilt, trauma, whatever it can find. Mark backed away. What do I do? He asked. Kastner looked at him with a sadness that suggested he already knew the answer. You return it, but not just to the sea, to the place it was last used, where it witnessed the suffering. Only then will it settle. St. Winifred's, Mark said. Yes, at night, alone. Mark didn't sleep that night. He packed, charged his dive gear, and by 3 a.m. he was gliding over black waters, the crucifix beside him wrapped in thick canvas, chained shut. He reached the site just before dawn, and dove. The ruins were colder than before, silent, as if the ocean itself were holding its breath. He descended past the broken arch, down to the chancel, where fragments of altar still clung to the seabed. He unwrapped the crucifix, positioned it where he'd first found it, and then he waited. The light shifted, the water grew still, and somewhere in the silt, something moved. Would you have gone back down? What would you have done with that crucifix? The story is only deepening, and we haven't reached the bottom yet. Don't miss the next chapter. Subscribe and share your theory in the comments. We're watching closely. The water grew still. That was the first thing Mark noticed. He hovered above the silted altar. The crucifix settled once more at its center and felt something impossible, an absence of current. The sea, which always moved, always pressed and pulled, was utterly still, as though the ocean itself had frozen in reverence or fear. The light from his flashlight reached only a few feet ahead. Beyond that, darkness. He adjusted his mask and kept breathing slowly, deliberately, trying not to let panic climb up his spine. But it was there, coiled and waiting. Mark hovered in silence, waiting for something, anything. Then, the silt stirred, not violently, just a shift, like a hand brushing along the sea floor. The chains on the crucifix quivered, and then he saw it, a hand, pale, boneless in its movement, reaching from beneath the crucifix. Mark's breath caught. He blinked, and it was gone. He turned slowly, his light sweeping over the ruined walls, the skeletal remains of pews, the crumbling arches above. Nothing, no movement, no life, just stone and darkness. But the crucifix was no longer still. The chains were beginning to unwind. Mark swam back instinctively, flashlight shaking. The chains uncoiled with deliberate slowness, one link at a time, like they were being released from beneath the iron. A soft vibration pulsed through the water, too low to be heard, but enough to set the fillings in his teeth on edge. Then a voice, no, a thought, pressed into his skull. Not in words, not clearly, just a sensation. Don't let it go. And then the shaking returned. His hands convulsed so violently he nearly dropped the flashlight. He gritted his teeth, steadied himself, and rose slowly, breaking the surface of the water as the sun crested the horizon. The air was still, not a sound. He climbed onto the boat in silence, his body soaked, trembling, eyes locked on the waves. He didn't speak all day, not to Kastner, who waited at the dock with eyes dark from lack of sleep, not to the sheriff, who had started checking on him unannounced. Mark only said one thing, "It's not done." Kastner's expression told him everything. He already knew. "You saw it," he said softly. Mark nodded. "I think it saw me too." The following morning a letter arrived. Not an email, a physical letter. No return address, just his name, typed in block font. Inside was a single photograph, sepia-toned, curled at the edges. It showed the inside of the chapel intact, benches full, a congregation of men in cassocks, all facing forward. But at the front, where the pulpit should have been, was the crucifix, not on the wall, upright, standing, and bound in chains. Each figure in the photo had no face, not obscured, missing, smoothed over as if the film had never captured them. Mark felt sick. His hands began to shake again. This time it didn't stop after an hour or two. He had to duct tape a spoon to his wrist just to eat soup. That night, Kastner called him from the motel. "Something new's come up," he said, voice clipped. "There's another crucifix in Ohio, but it's different, smaller, similar chain patterns. A woman found it buried in the walls of a demolished monastery near Lake Erie. Same symptoms, shaking, nightmares, audio hallucinations." "What happened to her?" Mark asked. "She vanished." The two sat in silence for a long time. "Maybe this wasn't the only one," Kastner continued. "Maybe these were made in sets." "Why?" Kastner hesitated. "You remember I said it was a ritual? What if this wasn't just psychological? What if it was something older? A replication of an ancient rite, intended to suppress more than just faith?" "You mean like spiritual containment?" Mark said. "Or worse, a warning, a barrier, something meant to hold something else." Mark closed his eyes. "So, if we removed it, we didn't just wake something," Kastner said. "We freed it." Mark thought of the chains. How tightly they had bound the figure, not a relic of devotion but imprisonment, a crucifix used in reverse. The next morning, the sheriff came knocking again. His tone had changed. "I've been told to stop asking questions. Got a call from a federal agency. No name, no badge number, just a message. Let it go. Will you?" Mark asked. "No," the sheriff said, "because I started looking into Father McCready." He handed Mark a folder. Inside were photocopied pages from an old diocesan registry, recovered from a retired bishop in Atlanta. McCready had been stationed at St. Winifred's, yes, but before that, he'd served overseas, in Syria, Turkey, places where early Christian and pre-Christian artifacts coexisted in abandoned ruins. One note stood out, a scribbled margin beside McCready's name. "Ask about the Iron Saint. Denied access to last tomb. Said chains were incomplete. Was afraid." The Iron Saint. Mark whispered the name aloud. It tasted like rust. Kastner met him later that afternoon. "I found something," he said, sliding open a laptop. On the screen, a scan of a classified document, decrypted and translated. It described a Cold War-era operation, codename Chapel Thorn, a military experiment. Location, Tybee Island. Date, 1966-1967. Primary objective, Test efficacy of psychospiritual stress inducement using recontextualized religious symbology. Recover artifact for containment protocol if phase fails. The document listed 3 crucifixes. Only one was recovered after the flood. Until now. Mark stared at the words. Recover, containment, inducement. This wasn't just about interrogation, he said. They were experimenting with objects, belief systems, trying to weaponize fear and faith. Kastner nodded, and they lost control. The final page of the document was a photo, badly degraded, but visible. A vault, lined with shelves. On each, bound religious artifacts, crosses, statues, even a chalice, each wrapped in the same black chain. In the center, a single figure with its back turned, arms outstretched. The caption read, Test Subject D, Post-exposure, ceased speaking, removed own tongue. Mark stood. He couldn't breathe. The shaking was back. That night he heard something outside his window. Not footsteps, not wind. A dragging sound, like chains scraping across gravel. He went to the shed. The crucifix was no longer wrapped. It stood upright on its own, as if it had never been moved at all. And the chains were gone. Kastner arrived 20 minutes later, flashlight in hand, eyes wide with fear. It's spreading, he said. The woman from Ohio, she's been seen. 3 states away, wandering, always at night, never speaking. Her hands, they shake too. Mark didn't respond. He couldn't. His hands were no longer shaking. They were still, too still, like something inside had stopped. Kastner whispered, You've been marked. That's when they decided. It had to go back, not just to the ruins, not just into the sea, but deeper, where no light reaches. The Mariana Trench was impossible, but there were fault lines off the coast, deep enough, remote enough. They rented a private trawler, told no one, packed the crucifix in lead, chains coiled, bound tight, a weight of 1,000 pounds. The plan was simple. Drop it. Let the pressure crush it. Let the darkness bury it for good. They set off at dawn. The sea was calm, too calm. When they reached the coordinates, Mark stood at the edge, hand on the winch. He looked at the ocean and felt it looking back. Last chance, Kastner said. Once it goes down, it's over. Mark said nothing. He pressed the switch. The chain whirred. The crate dropped, and the sea swallowed it without a sound. Mark exhaled for the first time in days. That night they returned to shore. They slept, and for the first time, there were no dreams. But when Mark woke, his hands were not his own. They were pale, thin, boneless in their movement, and they reached out to clasp nothing. The crucifix was gone, but something had stayed behind. Would you have dropped it into the sea, or tried to understand it first? Tell us in the comments. Your theory could help piece together the rest of this mystery. If this story kept your pulse up, give us a like and hit subscribe. We have more stories, some still unfolding, that you won't want to miss. And if you've ever seen an artifact that didn't feel right, let us know. You're not alone. 2 weeks passed. Mark hadn't left his home. Kastner returned to Baltimore, swearing he'd write up the case anonymously. But part of Mark doubted he ever would. Men like Kastner carried too many ghosts already. And this would be one ghost too many. The crucifix was gone. He told himself that. He'd seen it vanish into the ocean's throat, bound in chains, encased in lead, impossible to retrieve. But still, each morning, he'd wake and walk to the shed, half expecting to find it waiting, upright, watching. It never was, but that didn't mean the nightmare had ended. The tremors had stopped, yes. The visions, too. The hands that once reached from beneath the altar no longer haunted his sleep, but something in him had shifted, as though part of the crucifix had remained, etched into the nerves of his spine, humming low and constant like a wire under tension. Then, the envelope arrived. No return address, no postage, just a black wax seal, unbroken, pressed with a symbol he'd never seen before. 2 overlapping keys beneath an inverted halo. Inside, a single sheet. A message. You returned the chain, but not the memory. And attached, a photograph. A new one. Different location. Urban. A basement flooded by recent rains. In the center of the frame, a crucifix. Shorter, wrapped in chains identical to the ones Mark had touched. Same twisted design, same rusted sheen. Someone had found another. Mark stared at the photo until the ink blurred. Then he turned it over. On the back, a date circled in red, 3 weeks from now, and a location, St. Adalbert's, Detroit, Michigan. He knew that name, an abandoned cathedral, closed in the early 80s. Since then, it had been the subject of urban legend, sightings, strange sounds, flickering lights in a building long without power. Theories ranged from squatters to cult activity to ghosts. No proof, just whispers. Until now. The message was clear. The chain had never been singular. The ritual had been repeated. The crucifix Mark had pulled from the sea was only one in a series, each buried, sealed, or lost in places once considered holy, not to preserve faith, but to trap something. He called Kastner. The line rang twice, then went dead. That night, Mark drove 4 hours north, parked at a rest stop, and sat with his engine off, hands on the wheel, heart beating so loud he couldn't hear the radio. The next morning, the dreams returned. But this time, he wasn't watching the crucifix. He was part of it, bound, eyes forced open, a voice, not his own, whispering from inside his skull, "You freed it." The same day, reports hit the local news. A construction crew near Tybee Island uncovered a sealed room while digging for a new marina foundation. Beneath 10 feet of rock, they found remnants of a concrete floor, strange symbols, burnt wood, and iron nails embedded into the walls in the shape of a cruciform. No artifacts, just a deep, heavy silence. The area was cordoned off by Homeland Security within hours. The media called it a misidentified munitions depot, but locals knew better. They remembered the whispers, the disappearances, the flood that came too fast, too targeted. They'd buried something, and the sea was never meant to give it back. Mark returned to the coast one final time, not to dive, to listen. He sat on the edge of the dock, feet dangling above the water, watching the sun vanish behind gray clouds. The air was colder than it should have been. No birds, no wind, just silence. And beneath the waves, something stirred, not loudly, just enough, as if the ocean still remembered the weight of what it had once hidden, and missed it. He stood and walked back to the shed, now emptied, crucifix long gone. Still, the floorboards felt heavy, as though the object's absence weighed more than its presence ever had. Then the phone rang. He hadn't given his number out in weeks. He picked up. Static. Then a voice. Soft. Female. Broken. "I saw him. The priest. He said, he's still chained." Mark's mouth went dry. "Where?" he asked. But the line had already gone dead. No one called back. The next day, Mark booked a train to Detroit. He didn't pack much. Just gloves. And a single chain link he'd kept from the original crucifix, broken during its recovery. He didn't know why he'd kept it. Maybe to prove it had all been real. Maybe because he couldn't let go. He arrived at St. Adalbert's 3 days early. The building was worse than the photos. Boarded up, gutters torn away, vines choking the stained glass like veins. But the doors, they opened too easily. Inside, it was dark and cold. A smell clung to the air. Not mildew, not rot, iron. He moved slowly, flashlight sweeping over pews reduced to splinters, graffiti across crumbling stone, puddles of old rain soaking the tile. He descended into the crypt. The stairs held, just barely, and there, at the end of a narrow hall, was a chamber, newly disturbed, a hole in the far wall, leading down. He crouched, peered in, and saw the unmistakable silhouette of a crucifix, smaller, bound, waiting. He didn't go further, not that day, but he would, because the chain had returned, not just to the world, to him. He understood now. The objects weren't haunted. They weren't cursed. They were warnings, markers. And every time someone unearthed one, out of greed or fear or curiosity, they pulled the lid off something older than the church, older than scripture, something that had once been bound by faith, and now walked free. So the question now isn't what the crucifix is, it's how many are left, and how long we have before they all rise. Because what was buried wasn't forgotten, it was patient, and it's waiting for someone else to pull the next chain. And maybe that someone is you.